You're lying in bed. It's 1:47 a.m. You're not sad. You're not in crisis. Nothing dramatic happened today. But your brain is running a full investigation into a conversation you had 3 years ago, a decision you haven't made yet, and 17 different versions of a future that probably won't happen. And the worst part? You can't find the off switch. You've looked. It isn't there. This isn't insomnia. This isn't anxiety in the way most people describe it. This is something more specific, more invisible, and far more common than anyone admits out loud. And once you understand what's actually happening inside the brain when this occurs, you'll never call it just overthinking again. Here's what nobody tells you about overthinkers. They're not weak. They're not neurotic. They're not people who simply need to calm down or stop worrying so much. In fact, research suggests that chronic overthinkers tend to score significantly higher on measures of intelligence, empathy, and creative problem solving than their less ruminative counterparts. The brain that won't stop at night is often the same brain that catches what everyone else misses during the day, that sees the flaw in the plan before it becomes a crisis, that feels the shift in a room before anyone else notices something is wrong. But that exact same capability, running without direction, without an off switch, without understanding, becomes a prison. A very quiet, very exhausting, completely invisible prison that you carry everywhere you go. And here's the thing nobody explains. You didn't develop this pattern because something went wrong with you. You developed it because something very specific went right, in the wrong environment, at the wrong time. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you will completely change how you understand your own mind. Let's start at the beginning. Inside your brain, there is a structure called the amygdala. You've probably heard of it. But most explanations stop at "it's the fear center" and move on. That's like describing a Ferrari as a vehicle. Technically true. Completely misses the point. The amygdala is your brain's threat detection, and it is breathtakingly fast. It processes incoming information roughly 200 milliseconds faster than your conscious mind can catch up. Which means by the time you've decided whether something is dangerous, your amygdala has already sounded the alarm, flooded your system with stress hormones, and started generating protective responses. In a genuinely dangerous world, this is a masterpiece of engineering. You react before you think. You survive before you analyze. But here's where it gets complicated for overthinkers. The amygdala cannot distinguish between physical threats and social or emotional ones. A lion charging toward you and a critical email from your boss activate the same system. A near car accident and the memory of an embarrassing thing you said at a party in 2018 register in overlapping neural territory. The brain doesn't have a category for not actually life-threatening but still feels terrible. It just responds. And for some people, for reasons we'll get to in a moment, that system runs hotter than average, more sensitive, more frequently triggered, more resistant to the signals that are supposed to calm it down. This isn't a malfunction. This is a calibration. And it was calibrated by your history. This is the part most psychology content either skips entirely or handles so gently it loses the truth. So let's be direct. Chronic overthinking almost always has an origin point. Not a single dramatic event necessarily, though sometimes that's part of it. More often, it's an environment, a pattern, a repeated early experience that taught your nervous system a very specific lesson about the world. Maybe you grew up in a household where things were unpredictable, not necessarily dangerous in the obvious, but inconsistent. A parent whose mood you had to read before you knew how the day would go. An atmosphere where the emotional temperature could shift without warning, and you learned, young, to scan constantly for early signals. Maybe you were the child who got praised for being perceptive, for noticing things, for anticipating needs before they were expressed. And so your brain received a very clear message. Paying obsessive attention keeps you safe, keeps you loved, keeps things stable. Stop paying attention and something might fall apart. Or maybe it was subtler than that. A childhood where mistakes had disproportionate consequences, where getting things wrong felt genuinely dangerous to your standing, your safety, or your sense of self. And your brain, being the extraordinary survival machine that it is, decided that the best defense against making mistakes was to think about everything in advance, every outcome, every possibility, every way something could go wrong. Psychologists call this hypervigilance, and it is, at its origin, an act of love your nervous system performed for you. It was trying to protect you. It just never got the message that the original threat is gone. If you're watching this and feeling something shift in your chest right now, that recognition, that quiet, "this is me" feeling, stay here. Because we're about to get to the part that actually changes things, here's something genuinely fascinating that neuroscience has only recently started to fully understand. When the brain perceives an unresolved threat, whether real or imagined, present or remembered, it activates something called the default mode network. This is the neural network that becomes most active when you're not focused on an external task, when you're in the shower, trying to sleep, sitting in traffic, waiting for something to load. Most people think of that mental wandering as random. It isn't. Research from Harvard Medical School has shown that the default mode network has a strong bias toward threat-related content specifically. Your brain isn't daydreaming when it wanders. It's problem solving. It's scanning its archive of unresolved situations and running simulations, looking for solutions to loops it never managed to close. Every unresolved conflict, every decision not yet made, every relationship with uncertain standing, every version of yourself you're not sure you're living up to. The default mode network treats all of these as open files, and it keeps returning to them the moment your attention isn't pointed somewhere else. This is why overthinkers are often described as being somewhere else even when they're physically present. They're not checked out. They're doing triage on a system that has hundreds of unresolved items flagged for review. And here's the part that makes it worse. Thinking about a problem doesn't close the loop. Research by psychologist Sonia Lubomirsky found that rumination, the kind of circular repetitive thinking that overthinkers know intimately, every time you replay the conversation, re-examine the decision, rehearse the future confrontation, you're not solving it. You're making the groove deeper. You're training the brain to return there more automatically next time. It's the mental equivalent of trying to fill a hole by digging it. Now here's where it becomes genuinely unfair. And this might be the most important thing in this entire video. When overthinkers become aware of their overthinking, when they decide they need to stop, when they sit down and deliberately try to think less, something specific happens in the brain. Neuroscientists call it the rebound effect. Harvard psychologist Daniel Wegner spent years documenting what happens when people are instructed not to think about something. The result? Every single time, they think about it more. His famous white bear experiment showed that the act of suppressing a thought requires the brain to maintain an active monitor for that exact thought. The harder you try not to think, the louder the thinking becomes. This is why "just stop overthinking" is possibly the most useless advice ever given to an overthinker. It's the psychological equivalent of telling someone with a broken leg to simply walk it off. The instruction doesn't match the underlying reality of what's happening. And when overthinkers internalize the failure to stop, when the strategy doesn't work and the thoughts keep coming and they try harder and it gets worse, it becomes more evidence in the case against themselves. I can't even control my own mind. There must be something fundamentally broken in here. There isn't, but no one showed them where the actual door was. Here is the reframe. And again, this isn't the comfortable kind. This is the mechanically accurate kind. Overthinking is not a thinking problem. It is an unresolved emotion that the brain converted into thinking because thinking felt safer than feeling. Read that again. At the center of almost every persistent rumination loop is an emotion that hasn't been fully processed, not a question that hasn't been answered, not a decision that needs more information. An emotion that arrived, felt too large or too threatening or too vulnerable to sit with, and so the brain redirected that energy upward into analysis. If you think about it long enough, maybe you can think your way out of feeling it. You can't. But the brain tries anyway for hours, for years, for decades in some cases. Dr. Susan Nolan Hoeksema, one of the foremost researchers on rumination, found that the shift from emotional processing to analytical overthinking is significantly more common in people who received the message, explicitly or implicitly, that their emotions were too much, too intense, too inconvenient, too irrational. People who learned early that the way to handle big feelings was to get rational about them, to problem solve their way out of pain. So the brain obeys. It stops feeling and starts analyzing, and the analysis never ends because it was never the real point. You are not someone who thinks too much. You are someone whose nervous system learned that thinking was the safest response to a world that sometimes wasn't. You are someone whose brain is running protection software that was written for an older version of your life and never got updated. That is not a character flaw. That is not weakness. That is the residue of a mind that was doing everything it could with the information it had. The path out isn't forcing yourself to think less. It isn't meditation apps and productivity hacks and positive affirmations written on sticky notes. It is, honestly and carefully, learning to locate what the thinking is protecting you from, learning to let the emotion underneath actually complete, learning to update the threat assessment so your amygdala finally gets the message that this particular alarm has been running too long. That process is not quick, but it is entirely possible. And it starts with understanding that the brain keeping you awake at 1:47 a.m. isn't betraying you. It's the most loyal part of you still standing guard, still trying to keep you safe from something that probably stopped being dangerous a long time ago. You don't need to fight it. You need to finally let it rest. If this landed somewhere real in you, subscribe. Because this channel is built entirely around the kind of psychology that explains the things you've been quietly living with for years but never had language for.